So, greetings to the Research with International Students Network. We're very pleased to have the opportunity to present some recent research that we conducted on representing the problem of unethical practices in Canada's post-pandemic international student policy landscape. Our team is based at McGill University in Canada. We're all members of the new Higher Education Research Group there. I'm Dr. Emma Harden-Wolfson. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education.
I'm Dr. Shannon Hutcheson, and I'm a research associate at McGill University.
Hi, I'm Yvonne Zhang, and I'm a PhD student from Faculty of Education in McGill University.
So we want to start by reflecting on the fact that we're recording this on September the 30th, which in Canada is National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. This year, 2025, marks 10 years since the publication of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this came about primarily because of education. So it has, very significant links to the work that we're doing, the positions that we hold, the way that we organise higher education in Canada. And so we strongly encourage colleagues both in Canada and beyond to learn more about both the National Day, but also the ongoing processes of truth and reconciliation in Canada. And we hope that the links that we've provided on the screen here would provide a useful start for that journey. In terms of our research, we started off with noticing how international students are increasingly featured in the headlines in Canada. So here you see several snapshots from pieces published in late 2023 into 2024, looking at the number of international students being hosted in Canada, peaking at 1 million. That's the highest number that's ever been. Their contributions to the economy, the ways that the international student program, which is seen to kind of engineer inequality. And here also we see how concerns around international students are also starting to get connected into concerns about other domestic issues, whether the housing crisis or pressures on healthcare. And all of these kind of bubbling tendencies led us in our research to explore these two questions. So first, we wanted to look at how the Canadian policy landscape towards international students has changed since 2022. We use that as our starting point to position this primarily as what we might think of as post-pandemic, understanding that in 2022 and until today, we're still feeling very much the effects of the pandemic, but using that as a starting point. And how do recent policies, so that was between January 2022 and March 2024, construct the role of international students in Canada?
So in the first phase of our research, a policy mapping was conducted to systematically document and analyze the policies from Canadian government agencies that impact international students. We identified 4 primary policy sources, which including 2 federal agency and 2 provincial agency, and 3 secondary policy bodies, that is national higher education organizations, which relate to international education and will provide us some insider perspectives in these policy changes. So after 3 iterative rounds of searching and reviewing, a total of 97 international student policy announcements are collected in our database. So after 4 iterative process, we identify 9 policy categories, which represent the issues and themes of the policy announcements. However, I want to highlight the numbers of the appearance doesn't necessarily mean the importance of the policy category. For example, the Frenchization is an important policy topic for Quebec higher education, since we're only including 1 provincial policy sources, so the number is low in our final data collection. In many cases, 1 policy are tackling multiple issues, so therefore you can see some overlapping the frequency numbers in our data collection. So in our research, we noticed the policy concerns shifted based on coding these policy categories. So the policy announcement after June 2023 were more likely linking the immigration process and recruitment with the ethical issues, which reflect to our ethical practice category. And this category has been rapidly growth in 2024. So from January to March 2024, there were 10 announcements of ethical practice has been published by all the policy sources. Therefore, in this research, we're focusing on diving deeper in investigating the policy category of ethical practice as an emergent developing in policymaking. So before we're talking about our analysis framework, I want to highlight some key moments in this busy policy landscape shifting time. So the first policy shift is in 2022 that first, the fraudulent activities in international student recruitment has been mentioned, which relate to Quebec context. And moving to 2023, in the October, there has a signaling change for the whole international student programs in Canada. Then moving in the beginning of 2024, the first ever cap, international student enrollment cap, has been announced by IRCC. Then to responding this significant policy change, the Universities Canada and College and Institutes Canada released a joint response. So then in our research, we used Becky's what's the problem represent to be approach to critically analyzing the policy announcements. So WPR examining the problem represent in the policy, not the policy problem per se, or the intention behind the policy making. So therefore, Becky developed 6 questions as a guideline to help us to understand how governmental practice produce these problems, emphasizing the production itself rather than intention behind the policy body. And noticeably, the 6 questions, you don't have to follow all of them and answer all of them in your study, but rather act as a guideline. And also the 7th step is to writing that up and apply that in your study. So the 6 questions will be introduced in our findings.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that lead-in, Yvonne. So now we'll have a chance to take a closer look at WPR within the scope of our policy mapping, narrowing the focus on ethical practices. So the first question, what's the problem represented to be in a specific policy or policies? Sounds like a simple question, but it's quite a big question, as these first questions really help us understand the issue by framing and identifying the problem, and also identifying the context around that problem. So ethical practices within the context of our policy mapping referred to policy announcements which centered on fraud, equity, exploitation, accessibility, and elements of social justice. So in total, 25 of the 97 policy announcements included some element that fell under our categorization of ethical practices. So while all dimensions of ethical practices are really important and relevant, this analysis really centers more on how fraud and fraudulent practices have been captured using the WPR framework. So fraud is understood in different ways, but within our analysis, it's understood as perceived dishonest behaviors within international student recruitment and immigration. So this includes fraudulent activities of this word, unscrupulous actors. This is something that we've seen quite a bit in our policy analysis. And these unscrupulous actors are characterized as recruitment agents who recruit students for institutions at a profit, but also international students who are perceived as taking advantage of the Canadian immigration system for subsequent work. So another side of the coin for this is also wanting to bring attention to ethical practices in internationalization. So how can Canada be more welcoming, and also how can it be more supportive of international students? So now we'll go on to our second question. We've defined the problem, but now we have to understand what's lurking underneath the problem, and also what assumptions need to be made as we conceptualize what this problem is. So there's disagreement on this, and it really depends on who you ask. So we have the federal perspective, which sees a need to really curb and control and reduce immigration. And this is seen most largely in the January 2024 announcement that Yvonne talked about this international student enrollment cap. However, we also have these secondary policy sources who are really asking for development of more ethical practices in the international student program. And this leads to a big dilemma within this system. Whether you support students, supporting international students, or focus more on the integrity of immigration within the system. So looking on to the third question, how has this representation of the problem come about? This question really encourages more of a unpacking of the historical context of the problem, but also looking at how the problem has unfolded as seen through the chronological timeline that we've seen that Yvonne had shared with us. So Canada's aggressive internationalization strategy really led to a massive increase in international student numbers. This is a 200% growth that we've seen in the past decade. But we also see some concurrent trends. We have the profitability of international education versus ballooning international student numbers, and also these provincial labor market needs. For example, looking at an aging Canadian population, looking at international students to fulfill the market gap, for example, of elder care and also of healthcare. So the timeline reveals a number of precursors, but also warning signs and also wish lists. So I'll talk in a moment about this call and response that we have as federal agencies make dramatic policy changes and secondary agencies respond to these implications. Next, we have our fourth question. What is left unproblematic in this problem representation? Where are the silences? And can the problem be conceptualized differently? And as we see, there's really differences across the board in how these ethical practices are understood. So by and large, the federal responses blame unscrupulous actors for the inherent problems in the international student program. However, it doesn't really formally acknowledge the role that the government has actively had in perpetuating this issue. So we've seen over the years, not just in Canada, but elsewhere, decreased public funding for universities, also the privatization of higher education, and very limited ethical oversight in the recruitment of international students. So this internationalization strategy led to a dramatic shift in international student numbers with a focus on profit. And in some cases, we've looked at this labor market need for workers. So there's also increasing rhetoric around the impact on students, including limited housing and also looking at inclusion. So secondary policy sources are focusing more on supporting international students, the equity, diversity, and inclusion, and support for international students who are subject to sometimes these unethical practices. Looking to the fifth question, what effects discursive subjectification and lived are produced by the representation of the problem? So there's a real impact for how this problem is contextualized. One of the biggest and probably really harmful things that we're seeing here and to the south with our neighbors in the United States is this growing anti-international student and growing anti-immigration sentiment that has really put students in danger. And we also have international students receiving consistent blame for housing and healthcare crises. How these problems are conceptualized are also impacting the brand of the EduCanada brand for higher education. You know, is Canada a safe place for students to come and a safe place for students to study? And we also have these growing pains and practical challenges of this massive restructuring. So in current headlines, we have students who are actually taking legal action against the Canadian government due to increased timelines for processing study visas. And this is a direct implication of these new policy changes. And then finally, for the sixth question, how and where has this representation of the problem been produced, disseminated, and defended? Again, we've noted that there's a distinct pattern of call and responses, the federal policy rollout, and secondary policy agencies responding to that. While there are differences in how the problem is perceived, there is some consensus and some convergence. Mainly this need for sustainability. So there's an agreement that international education has kind of spiraled out of control because of its deregulation. but we need to identify what does a sustainable international education look like in the future, making sure that students are supported. We also have some particularities for provinces where Quebec has a desire to link immigration with language competency, for example, drawing more French speakers to Quebec. And finally, for the Federal Immigration Agency, the enrollment cap and further regulation, they believe that this is needed. But as these quick rollouts occur and there's a real human impact, we're curious to see how that unfolds. All right, I'll leave it to my colleague, Emma.
Wonderful. So that gives you a brief snapshot of how we went about the study and what we found using the questions of the WPR approach. So here's the big question then. So who's to blame for these ethical, or in this case, unethical practices? So we identified in the study 4 key groups of actors. So we start in the top right of your screen looking at the federal and provincial governments, remembering that in the Canadian context, education is a provincial responsibility, whereas immigration is a shared responsibility between the federal and provincial and territorial governments. Well, perhaps this is the nature of our focus on what we've called the primary policy bodies, the federal and 2 of the provincial governments, in addition to the secondary policy bodies. But looking across these announcements, there's no blame assigned to the federal or the provincial governments for any of the issues which are occurring. Going down in clockwise, higher education institutions as another group are seen, they're implicated in these unethical practices, but really seen at most as passive participants in this fraudulent activity. So, for example, accepting students who may have been working with agents who may have been working themselves in unscrupulous ways, but not really kind of taking active measures to combat that. That leads us to recruitment agents, also known as education agents. They are definitely some of the blame is passed on to them, for example, making false promises of an immigration backdoor into Canada. We've seen since the 2000s this emergence of a nexus between education and immigration in Canada, which largely rests on this premise that as an international student, you can come to Canada and then you can stay as a short or a longer term immigrant after your study period is finished. So we certainly see some of the blame ascribed to recruitment agents, but it's really international students as well who are also kind of part of the mix here. If agents are kind of the key concern for the federal and provincial governments, so students come up in a slightly different way. So on the one hand, we're to feel sorry, in effect, for these students as victims who've been taken advantage of. And in that sense, they're constructed in a very passive, non-sort of agentic way. But at the same time, some blame is also ascribed to international students for these broader problems that we've referred to, for housing issues, pressures, for healthcare issues. But in the end, these are problems that are not made by international students, and yet we see them connected. So you can see it's kind of a fairly complicated picture that we have here. It's an easy question to ask, but as we've indicated, not necessarily an easy one to answer. So where does that leave us? We finished data collection in mid-2024. We're recording this, as we've mentioned, in later 2025. So since that period has passed and we finished the data collection for our piece, we're still seeing these concerns ongoing about unethical practices. And in fact, actually, that links to concerns about fraudulent study applications, which have been coming up since the 2010s. So in that sense, we're seeing a bit of a continuation. We're now in a period of the second federal enrollment cap for 2025. We've also had a change of government at federal level in Canada. So it's unclear at the moment what will happen to the enrollment cap in 2026 and beyond. I would suggest that it's going to continue. I don't think there's any appetite at the moment to really kind of make any further substantial changes. But what I think we will see is a lot of smaller pieces of regulation and adjustments to guidance that we already now have in place. As a result, we're seeing new regulations for provinces and territories during the admissions process for international students. So that changes the way both that the federal and the provincial and territorial governments relate to each other, but also how they work with international students and with higher education institutions. We've mentioned a couple of times this francisation imperative, which is still very much on the agenda in Quebec. That's an intersecting policy problem that currently remains underexplored, as does the fact that we're handling all of this in a broader global context where we're seeing some very complex and turbulent geopolitical challenges. So at the moment, our team is working on that last piece in particular, but there's plenty of scope for those of you who are working in this area or interested in this area of research to take it in different and promising directions. So thank you very much for listening to our presentation. We hope you'll want to find out more. The QR code here will take you to a copy of the article, which is published in open access. So thank you. Merci.